According to the chart, we are on Canto 3, Chapter 16, Text 13 and 14 today. That's okay. So I'll read this one by myself, and then we will do the next verse responsively. Brahmovacha atatosya satim devim rishikulyam sarasvatim nasvadya manyudashtanam tesham atmapyatripyata. Brahma continued, even though the sages had been bitten by the serpent of anger, their souls were not satiated with hearing the Lord's lovely and illuminating speech, which was like a series of Vedic hymns. So I'll read that again. Brahma continued, even though the sages had been bitten by the serpent of anger, their souls were not satiated with hearing the Lord's lovely and illuminating speech, which was like a series of Vedic hymns. So here we can do this verse responsibly. Satim vadaya shrinvanto. Satim vyadaya shrinvanto. Satim vyadaya shrinvanto. Satim vyadaya shrinvanto. Lagvim gurvarta gahvaram. Lagvim gurvarta gahvaram. Vigahyad gada gambiram. Vigahyagada gambiram. Navidus tachchikirshitam. Navidus tachchikirshitam. Satim vyadaya shrinvanto. Lagvim gurvarta gahvaram. Vigahyad gada gambiram. Navidus tachchikirshitam. Satim vyadaya shrinvanto. Lagvim gurvarta gahvaram. Vigahyad gada gambiram. Navidus tachchikirshitam. Satim vyadaya shrinvanto. Lagvim gurvarta gahvaram. Vigahyagada gambiram. Navidus tachchikirshitam. Satim vyadaya shrinvanto. Lagvim gurvarta gahvaram. Vigahyagada gambiram. Navidus tachchikirshitam. Satim vyadaya shrinvanto. Lagvim gurvarta gahvaram. Vigahyagada gambiram. Navidus tachchikirshitam. Satim vyadaya shrinvanto. Lagvim gurvarta gahvaram. Vigahya Gadha Gambhiram Navidus Tachchikirshitam. Vaishnavis. Satim Vyadaya Shrinvanto Lagvim Gurvarta Gahvaram Vigahya Gadha Gambhiram Navidus Tachchikirshitam Satim. Excellent. Vyadaya. With attentive oral reception. Shrinvantaha. Hearing. Lagvim. Properly composed. Guru. Momentous. Artha. Import. Gavaram. Difficult to understand. Vigahya. Pondering. Agadha. Deep. Gambhiram. Grave. Not. Viduhu. Understand. Tat. Of the Supreme Lord. Chikirshitam. The intention. So the translation reads, the Lord's excellent speech was difficult to comprehend because of its momentous import and its most profound significance. The sages heard it with wide open ears and pondered it as well. But although hearing, they could not understand what he intended to do. So we'll do this responsively. The Lord's excellent speech was difficult to comprehend because of its momentous import and its most profound significance. The sages heard it with wide open ears and pondered it as well. But although hearing, they could not understand what he intended to do. Okay, so here is Prabhupada's purport. It should be understood that no one can surpass the Supreme Personality of Godhead in speaking. There's no difference between the Supreme Person and his speeches, for he stands on the absolute platform. The sages tried with wide open ears to understand the words from the lips of the Supreme Lord. But although his speech was very concise and meaningful, the sages could not completely comprehend what he was saying. They could not even comprehend the purport of the speech or what the Supreme Lord wanted to do. Nor could they understand whether the Lord was angry or pleased with them. Satim Vyadaya Shrinvanto Lagvim Gurvarta Gahvaram Vigahya Gadha Gambhiram Navidus Tachchikirshitam. The Lord's excellent speech was difficult to comprehend because of its momentous import and its most profound significance. The sages heard it with wide open ears and pondered it as well. But although hearing, they could not understand what he intended to do. This is one of those sections of Srimad Bhagavatam where there's a lot going on simultaneously, and it's kind of like looking at something through a whole group of different levels and perspectives, because depending on your perspective or depending on your level of awareness, there are different things going on. And in one sense, that's why it's confusing. Of course, the Supreme Lord, one of his characteristics is that he accomplishes many purposes with a single act. And he sometimes accomplishes many explanations with a single verbal utterance. So he's able to do and speak in such a way that it can mean multiple things at the same time. And one of the things that I've realized in Krishna consciousness is that no matter how long you've been around Krishna consciousness, there's always something new, something you didn't pick up on. There's always something that you're just starting to recognize. It's a bottomless well, no matter how deeply you go into it. You always realize there's yet another level that you didn't quite grasp yesterday, that you didn't quite grasp last year, but now you're beginning to grasp it. And you begin to understand how other people could have had a different perspective on what just happened or what was just said. The interesting thing also about the Supreme Lord is because he's at the root of all reality, that whatever he does is perfect because he is the complete whole. Whatever he says has a number of angles to it because he is at the root of all existence. So whatever part of reality you're plugged into, the Supreme Lord cuts across it to some extent. And this is what's interesting about the world that we live in. It appears to be mundane, and we certainly get used to it. We walk around in the world and we see things the way that they are every day. On the street we see people. We go in the subway. We distribute some books. We eat something. We have a program. Somebody interacts with us with some words. And this all seems pretty, usual about the way the material universe works. But even this universe that we can connect with, if you look a little closer in between the cracks, you'll see that there are hidden worlds everywhere, that things are not always as they seem. We are just used to seeing things in a certain way. We're used to responding to things in a certain way. And from a cultural perspective, we've grown up and we've become patterned to dealing with things in a certain way. So we kind of get what's known, I guess, as taking things for granted. That's one way to say it. But there are a lot of mysterious things going on everywhere. I think of even something like music. Music is, we all hear it, we all know what it is, we've all dealt with it since we were children. It's a very mysterious thing when you think about it, that something about tones, something about information, it somehow reaches emotions which normally aren't reached in normal conversations. It has a soothing quality in most cases. And how do people write it? How do people sing it or play it or various kinds of methods for causing it to come into existence? And although it's just a series of tones, in various ways, there's something more to it than that. It's like a thing in itself. There is nothing else like music. And I just bring this out as a example, because there's so many things like that we take for granted, we see every day, but when you stop and actually think about what's going on, you begin to realize it's more mysterious than you thought. And similarly, I've talked about before, we have this external world we're used to inhabiting, and mostly this external world is all about the eyes, about vision. We see things, we have spatial perspective, we know what people look like, we know how far they are from us. But although we see people, we have relationships with them which we don't see. We experience the relationships, and the relationships are internal. And so here the four Kumaras are coming into a situation. They have never met the Supreme Personality of Godhead before. They've heard that he existed. They did understand the Brahman, and we know Vedanti tat tattvat vidhas tattvam yajganam advayam brahmeti parmatmeti bhagavaniti shabjate. That the sages have declared that of this non-dual substance, it has three features, and they are Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. So the Supreme Lord is not separate from the Brahman, he is not separate from the Paramatma, yet in one sense we talk about them separately, just like we talk about the heat and the illumination from fire. Fire is fire, it has both heat and illumination, yet we talk about the light from fire and we talk about the heat from the fire, and they're thought of in a different way, even though they're integrated. So the four Kumaras are strangers on the scene, as we could say, strangers in paradise. Actually, that's literally what's happening there. They're at the gates of Vaikuntha, and they've been blocked from entering by Jaya and Vijaya, and they've cursed Jaya and Vijaya, and the Supreme Lord could understand that his presence was required, because that's why the sages came. And if Jaya and Vijaya were going to block them from going into Vaikuntha, then the Supreme Lord had to come to them. And he did that. He came to see them. And the four Kumaras are the new kids on the block. They've not been in Vaikuntha, nor have they been, privy or given darshan of the Supreme Lord before. So they're puzzling their way through this situation. New experiences are happening. Immediately, because of their piety and because of their purity, when the Supreme Lord came on the scene, they were immediately connected, like like a plug going into a socket or something like that. They didn't think, oh, what is this interesting thing I'm seeing? They knew right away that this interesting thing they're seeing is the Supreme Lord. And they immediately felt a relationship with the Supreme Lord, and they immediately felt the gravity of being in the presence of the Supreme Lord. All this was immediately bestowed on them. So visually they saw the Supreme Lord, which was a novelty for them, but internally they experienced more than they had experienced with their Brahman realization in previous times. And they could understand it was an extension of that Brahman. So they had many experiences simultaneously. So they were still, as this verse indicates, partly engulfed in the anger that had arisen when they had been blocked from going to Vaikuntha. But of course, at this point, suddenly, that all seems petty, They were angry that they couldn't go in. They had cursed the gatekeepers, Jaya and Vijaya. But now suddenly they see the Supreme Lord. It's like, new game. Everything is different now. Now the Supreme Lord is here. That's why we came here. We don't have to go into Vaikuntha now. We've gotten what we actually came after. And immediately they feel that what they did was unwanted, unwarranted. Now, they're feeling sorry for having cursed Jaya and Vijaya. Jaya and Vijaya are feeling sorry for having blocked the four Kumaras. The Supreme Lord is feeling sorry because this happened to, the four sages. So we have this kind of complex thing, and each is feeling a sense of we done wrong, So the Jaya and Vijaya are feeling, well, whatever happens to us, we've been cursed, we deserve it. The four Kumaras are thinking, and they'll say it in a few verses, that, my dear Lord, we feel that we curse them unnecessarily, they're innocent people, so we await whatever punishment we're due. So they're awaiting their version of the punishment. And they're wondering, so they're feeling elated they've seen the Supreme Lord. They were feeling angry that they've been cursed. And now they're feeling apprehensive that maybe they will have something befall them as a result of this unauthorized curse. And so as we've said before, the first 12 verses of this chapter, of chapter 16, were about this reply of the Supreme Lord to the four Kumaras. And when the Supreme Lord is speaking, they're not clear. Is he happy? Is he angry at them? They've never met him before, so they're not clear how to read the situation. And they're kind of resigned to whatever fate might come their way. As it is revealed, the Supreme Lord is not angry with them for having cursed Jaya and Vijaya. And this is another level, that they've cursed Jaya and Vijaya, but the Supreme Lord says, I accept this curse. Even I wanted this curse. So they're thinking, we just in the heat of a moment, overreacted, but the Supreme Lord seems to be vouching for this thing to happen. And of course, what the four Kumaras don't know, what they're out of the loop on, is that this is a pastime taking place. They are, brahmanas, or those who knew Brahman. But now they're actually witnessing a pastime, and it's not an ordinary pastime, it's a very subtle pastime that, as we said before, there's a lot of things operating, and we begin to see pieces of them as this story unfolds in Bhagavatam. We will find that Jaya and Vijaya, before they prevented the four Kumaras from entering into the gates of Vaikuntha, they had stopped the goddess of fortune, Lakshmi Devi, herself from going in. And she had become angry with them. So this is partly a reaction to the fact that they blocked Lakshmi Devi before they blocked the four Kumaras. Now, why did the Jaya and Vijaya block Lakshmi Devi? Because the Supreme Lord was asleep. But woe unto someone who blocks a wife from seeing a husband when he's asleep. That's, I guess they learned the hard way on that one, So, at any rate, they wound up in this situation. But we also find out that, as we talked about the other day with the Madhurya Kadambini, that Jaya and Vijaya had volunteered to take the position of fighting with the Supreme Lord in the material world, because there were no powerful demons in the material world. So therefore, the Supreme Lord wanted to fight. So they said, all right, if you want to fight, then, if there's nobody else to do it, hey, we'll volunteer. So they did, and now this whole thing has happened. So it's not really a mistake by the four Kumaras. It was a setup. And because the four Kumaras acted impulsively, not the four Kumaras, the Jaya and Vijaya acted impulsively and stopped the four Kumaras. And the four Kumaras acted impulsively and cursed Jaya and Vijaya. This arrangement has been set up, and the Supreme Lord wanted it. This is the pretext on which Jaya and Vijaya will go to the material world and become very powerful demons. In fact, 4 different incarnations of very powerful demons. And they will indeed fight with the Supreme Lord, and the Supreme Lord will enjoy it. And of course, there's more to the whole story than that, but that's why I'm explaining how there's different layers of things going on here. So, from the four Kumaras' point of view, they're just awakening to seeing the Supreme Lord as a person, and they're awakening to the idea of actually recognizing that the Supreme Lord has feelings for his devotees, including them. What Burijan mentions, and is kind of subtly hinted at in this section of Srimad Bhagavatam, is that we discover that the Supreme Lord has a much more intimate relationship with Jaya and Vijaya than he does with the four Kumaras, because the four Kumaras are just getting started. So Jaya and Vijaya are being chastised, and yet they are just performing a role. And yet the Supreme Lord is protecting them. So how is he protecting them? He's asking the four Kumaras, my dear four Kumaras, please make it so that they can come back soon, that they were not gone for very long. Of course, when the Supreme Lord says soon, when we're talking about soon in the Vaikuntha level, I mean millions of years, is still soon. And as we know, Jaya and Vijaya go through 4 incarnations, and these demons, Hiranyakashipu and Hiranyaksha, they live for I don't know what, thousands, millions of years. I don't know. They live for a long time. But they come back soon. So no matter how long we've been in the material world, when we come back, it's soon. Of course, while we're in the material world, it don't feel like soon at all. It feels quite different. We have been lost for such a long time. So the Supreme Lord is protecting them, and he's saying, this is another mysterious thing, that they will be intimately connected with him through their constant meditation. Now we know what kind of meditation does Hiranyakashipu and Hiranyaksha have on the Supreme Lord. Not a favorable meditation, but they're both meditating on the Supreme Lord, both brothers. And although it's not favorable, still, underneath it all, they're devotees. So because they're devotees, they are still connected with the Supreme Lord. And as a result, they will be protected from the fact that they are acting as demons, So after they're killed by Nrsingadev and by Varahadev, Hiranyakashipu and Hiranyaksha will again take birth and be killed by the Supreme Lord a second time, and then eventually a third time, the second time, of course, by Ramachandra, and the third time by Krishna himself. So this is how they will interact with the Supreme Lord, and the Supreme Lord is enjoying. So you can imagine this mysterious smile. It's focused on in the Vedic literatures in a number of places. The Supreme Lord has a mysterious smile. Is it impish exactly? Is it kind of two things at one time? Is it inscrutable, it's probably all those things, you know. It's a smile that is hard to read because the Supreme Lord is everything simultaneously. So this is kind of some of what's going on here. And the four Kumaras have begun their walk into the path of bhakti. So before they were impersonalists, now they have become personalists, and they're starting to wake up to the nuances of relationships and rasa, which is why we say that devotees are totally uninterested in the Brahman realization, because it has no form, it has no variety, there is no deep emotion there. There is only the bliss, or Brahmananda as it's called, the bliss of Brahman. But compared to the dynamic and human and interactional layers and levels that are involved with interacting with the Supreme Lord, this Brahman realization is of no consequence, of no particular interest. And that's why devotees find it even hellish. They try to avoid it, because in Brahman there is no servitor, there's no service, and there's no one to be served. It's just So we're just in white light where there's nothing going on, nothing about to go on. There's nothing to see, everything is just white. There's no forms, there's nothing to smell. There's nothing to feel except for a kind of and that's about it, you know. And you can see how that would kind of get old after a while. And it does, and that's why ye nye ravindaksha vimukta maninas tvayashta bhavad avashuddha buddhaya aruya krishna param padam tata patantiyadho nadrata yusmadangreya. That those who imagine themselves very advanced, but their intelligence is not clean or pure, they fall down again, because there is something profoundly unsatisfying about a changeless so-called bliss of Brahman. So the four Kumaras had it, but when they met Krishna, they weren't interested anymore. And so this is the nature of the thing going on here. So in this chapter, there have been a lot of things that have been discussed. I'll sort of list a few of them, and then if there's any questions about any of them, we can go a little bit further. So we are hearing in this chapter about the Supreme Lord's care and protection. We're hearing about a leader taking on the sins, faults, or offenses of a subordinate. We're hearing about this mystery question of who was right and who was wrong. Were the four Kumaras right? Were the Jaya and Vijaya right? Who is actually right or wrong here? We're hearing about the goddess of fortune, how the Supreme Lord is with the goddess of fortune. And everybody in the material world is after the goddess of fortune. But the Supreme Lord, although he has no particular attraction to her, she has great love for him. And why does the goddess of fortune have love for him? She has love for him because of his loving dealings with devotees. That's why she's attracted to him. And that we find that prasadam is very amazing. That's one of the things we hear in this whole section here, that the tulsi leaves were there, and the four Kumaras got prasadam, and then we hear about how Advaitacharya offered pinda to Haridas Thakur, we hear about this mysterious material world, which is like the banyan tree that we hear in chapter 15 of Bhagavad Gita. A few days ago, we heard about defenseless creatures, how they need to be protected, the brahmanas, women, and children. And people who do not protect these defenseless creatures are like snakes, and the vultures of Yamaraj will come and eat those serpents and cause them great pain. Then a day or two ago, we heard about Brahminical chastisement. I think that was where that verse was our Hari Vilas was talking about. Or Hari. Yeah, he was talking about that one. Then we heard about fall downs, and this is an accident or not an accident. That's what we heard about. So, any questions or comments?
Hari Bo. So I wanted to ask you something that I was thinking about when you were speaking about that there is always something new that comes into Krishna consciousness, which is very interesting. So something that I have been observing is that you're trying to grasp on a certain subject matter and you can't yet understand it for some reason, and you're looking for answers, and you're asking many devotees, and they're giving you answer, but still it feels like they're not completely answering your question. And then after some time comes the devotee who gives you just the right answer. They're like, yes, this is it, I got it now. So the question is this because of your own lack of realization and you need to get purified a little bit more, or it's because apparently these devotees they also don't understand it as much, or they cannot explain it as well for you to understand, or both ways? If you can comment on that.
Well, actually, I'm glad you brought this up. I've thought about this times, sometimes you really want to know what the right thing is. And, sometimes you're praying to Radha Govinda Dev on the altar, what's the right thing? And you get that mysterious smile. Is it a yes? Is it a no? Is it maybe? And I think that it's the answer you're getting is wait, or you need to go through some internal purification before the answer will mean something to you. So sometimes that's what's happening. That one of the things I've known from being alive as long as I have been is that whatever is a big mystery to you today, rest assured in 5 years, it won't be a mystery anymore. It'll be like, slam dunk. You'll know what was wrong or right at that point. Right now it may be a big mystery, but 5 years from now it won't be. So you can kind of sort of feel, all right, eventually I'll know what's up with this, And of course it is true that in communication between devotees asking questions and devotees answering questions, sometimes the devotee doesn't ask the question that they really have. They ask a question that's approximately close to it, and sometimes the person answering can understand what the real question is and answer that, and then the devotee feels satisfied. And sometimes the person tries to answer the question that's actually being asked, which is a little off-center, and then the devotee says, all right, but, so that's going on too on occasions. And and sometimes a devotee has particular realization about something, and when the person asking the question asks the question and goes, oh, I've been there, as they say, I've been there, got the t-shirt, I've been there, done that, and got the t-shirt, as they say. So I know where that's coming from, and so you can answer it in that way with a sense of personal. Of course, that's why I think always, and I try to do this often, did I get your point? Because, sometimes when people ask a question, you answer what you think is the question, and then you want to hear back from them. Not just that they say yes, just so you'll feel like you can sign off on it. That's not what I'm interested in doing. I'm interested in knowing, was that the real question? Because sometimes it's not easy to understand what the question is, and of course there's the other thing, in a room like this with terrible acoustics, that there is the double, yab, what, I say, what, so you try to decipher the slapback, that, come, pom, that, speak, being, fight, bouncing off the walls, so it kind of does a whole thing on you. I've found that's one of the reasons I get very close to the speaker, so I can actually hear just one version of what's happening. You all have better ears, but I've, punished my ears, way before I even came to Krishna Consciousness. There was rock music, and then, with Krishna Consciousness, the Wampers and the Killer, the real heavy metal, the devotional heavy metal, of Wampers and Kartals and Mridungas and everything. So at any rate, that's also, I think, sometimes operative. But I think that oftentimes when the time is right, the question gets answered. Sometimes without even somebody answering it, you just realize this is what it is. And I think that's what's happening to the four Kumaras here. They have a question, what does the Supreme Lord actually think about this situation? And they don't have an answer for it. But in time, I'm sure they did. They became more acquainted with the Supreme Lord and his dealings, and they could understand that this was the way that he deals with things, and they could understand, Also, it helps to be in the association of devotees, because we can see how devotees respond to things, and then we can get some, mile markers and some compass, direction there. How did other devotees respond to it? What was their take on it? And that's exactly what Prabhupada does, and what all the acharyas do when they're explaining these verses. They look at the various purports and the explanations of previous acharyas. And generally they fall, and if you read the previous acharyas' explanations of verses, you begin to see how close Prabhupada comes to them. He's explaining things in a similar way that other acharyas have explained them. And this is part of our whole system. Of course, some things are unique, and there was something very amazing about Prabhupada's being able to take very high, nebulous, confusing things and just cut right to the core of them and explain them in a few words where you weren't doubtful anymore. Of course, for some people, they experienced that, where Prabhupada's answer, like Krishna's, was, puzzling, with a question mark with two exclamation points after it. And of course, with time, that, I think, becomes understood.
Just wanted to add a small comment on your topic of mysterious things that we have in this world that we take for granted.
Yeah.
I remember when I was a kid, I was observing certain things. For example, I was fortunate enough that my great-grandmother was still living in the village, and they were cooking on fire, for example. So many times I was observing the fire in the evenings when they were cooking, and I was like looking, wow, this is far out, You have a piece of wood and something is coming out which is like
Yeah,
It's far out, and nobody says anything about it.
Right,
Nobody's
right.
like
It is
amazed.
very strange.
But it's weird, It's like, what the hell is this?
Right, right.
Or another time I was observing like people, for example, when people walk, they do it like this. Why are they moving their hands? They can just walk like this. They're moving their hands. So it's something strange.
Yeah,
But we don't
we
necessarily.
There's a lot of unusual things that are going on in this world. Before I became a devotee, about a year before I became a devotee, I was working in a vegetarian restaurant, and there was a girl who was, she claimed to be a psychic reader, And so I said, well, can you do a psychic reading? And she told me that I would become involved in spiritual life and give my whole life to it. She knew before I knew. So it was kind of, strange, how these things happen, Was it a coincidence? Some people would say like that, but what would prompt a person to say something like that, And, any rate, and at that time, you would never have, I didn't seem like the kind of person that would become involved in spiritual life. I had a whole other agenda going on. It wasn't like it was, you could just kind of guess it from what I was already doing. So there's all these kind of mysterious things going on in this world. And we take them for granted. You take an acorn, a very small thing. If you put it on a shelf, it'll stay there for years, But you put it in the ground and put a little water there, and you come back 50 or 100 years later, there's this huge tree. How does that happen, How does this little acorn create a situation where it gets things from around itself, the dirt, and transforms itself over a long period of time into a huge tree? It's hard to we see it and we're just completely callous to the fact that this is bizarre thing, that you put a little thing in the ground. If I put this bottle cap in the ground, nothing's going to happen, But if I put, an acorn in the ground, a huge tree comes out of it in due time, And if it's an acorn, it's always going to be an oak tree. You're not going to get a lemon tree. You're not going to get a cabbage. You're going to get an oak tree, always an oak tree, So it's kind of interesting. Where does all that wood come from? The little seed somehow or another figures out how to get it. And at any rate, any other final questions? Okay.
You're talking about that, like many people try to answer the question and then somebody finally does. So there's a Leela in the Srimad Bhagavatam where where Yudhishthira is very upset because he's feeling bad that all these people had to be killed for him to be made king, and different people try to pacify him, including Krishna himself. But even Krishna is unable to pacify him because he wanted that Bhishma could pacify him.
Yeah.
So you could say that, that Krishna just wants a certain devotee to be the person who gives you the answer, and that's
that's
why
an
it
interesting.
Happens, It could have been somebody else.
That's an interesting example.
Krishna's desire, So.
Yeah, Yudhishthira was disconsolate. He wasn't able. He wasn't having any kind of relief from the enormous death that happened at the Battle of Kurukshetra until Bhishma Dev spoke to him. So that was where he had his epiphany, only with Bhishma Dev. So Krishna wanted Bhishma Dev to be the source, and actually it mentions that in the Mahabharata. I was looking for it this morning, but I couldn't find it. I think actually there's a story that Vyasadeva had thought about writing the Mahabharata. And he saw in the forest something happened, some animal killed some other animal, and he was very angered by it. And he said something about it. And then he realized that was the perfect meter to, I have to look at it again. I might be confusing something, but it's one of those things where from something that seems completely irrelevant, then he's got the perfect meter to write the Mahabharata, or... Oh, at any rate, we are at 4 minutes after, so unless someone has a question, we're going to put the cap on it today. And thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glorious to Srimad Bhagavatam, all glorious to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.